It was November 1996 when the fifth-generation Honda Prelude arrived in showrooms. It looked like a machine sent back from a sharper, faster future. The engineers had packed it with technology that promised to redefine how a front-wheel drive car could handle, but they did not know that the world was already changing around them. This car was meant to be the next step in the evolution of the sports coupe. Instead, it became a final, brilliant monument to an era that was about to disappear forever. To understand this car, you have to understand the company that built it. By the mid-1990s, Honda was standing at a crossroads. The Japanese economy was deep in the struggle known as the lost decade. The easy money of the bubble era was gone. Most manufacturers responded by cutting costs, sharing platforms, and simplifying their designs to survive. Toyota was beginning to decontent the Celica. Nissan was preparing to end production of the 240SX. The golden age of the Japanese sports coupe seemed to be fading. But Honda took a different path. They were a company run by engineers, not accountants. They decided that the solution to a changing market was not less engineering, but more. They wanted to prove that they could build the most sophisticated front-wheel drive chassis in the world. The Prelude had always been special in the Honda lineup. It was never the highest volume seller like the Civic or the Accord. It was the laboratory. It was the place where Honda tested their wildest ideas before they trickled down to the rest of the fleet. In the past, the Prelude was the car that introduced mechanical four-wheel steering to the masses. It was the first platform to bring the VTEC engine to the United States. For the fifth generation, the mandate was even stricter. The car had to be smarter. By 1995, the market for two-door sports coupes was already collapsing. Sales of the previous generation, Prelude in the United States, had fallen from 36,000 units in 1992 to just over 12,000 in 1995. Younger buyers were starting to look at a new type of vehicle called the sport utility vehicle. The practical choice was winning over the emotional choice. A normal car company would have looked at those numbers and killed the model. They would have shifted resources to the CR-V and moved on. But Honda needed a halo car. They needed a vehicle that demonstrated their technical dominance. So, instead of retreating, they pushed forward. They treated the fifth-generation Prelude as a technology testbed. Motor Trend magazine even called it exactly that. The goal was to create a car that felt expensive, solid, and incredibly capable. They were not trying to build a cheap car for everyone. They were trying to build a perfect car for the few people who still cared about the art of driving. This was a time when Honda felt untouchable. Their reliability was legendary. They had a level of technical confidence that few companies have ever matched. The strategy was bold. They would take the Prelude up market. They would make it heavier, stiffer, and more refined. They would charge a premium price that put it in competition with entry-level luxury cars. It was a real gamble that relied on the belief that quality would always find a buyer. This decision defined the entire character of the car. It explains why every switch feels weighted and precise. It explains why the door shuts with a heavy thud rather than a tinny clang. The term near luxury was thrown around a lot in the 90s. It usually meant leather seats and wood trim glued onto a budget chassis. Honda took it literally. They engineered the luxury into the metal itself. The engineers were given the freedom to solve problems that other manufacturers simply ignored. They wanted to eliminate understeer. They wanted to banish vibration. They wanted to create a driving experience that defied conventional front-wheel drive limits. This was the peak of the golden era. It was a moment when the pursuit of mechanical perfection mattered more than the bottom line. They were preparing to unveil a piece of technology so advanced it would seemingly defy the laws of physics. A secret weapon hidden in the front axle that we will get to shortly. But while the corporate strategy was focused on pure engineering dominance, the execution required a complete rethink of the car's physical presence. When the cover was finally pulled off the new car in late 1996, the reaction was mixed. The previous generation, the fourth-generation Prelude, had been a curvaceous, organic shape. It was low, wide, and futuristic, with a dashboard that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. It was a design of the early 90s bubble. full of optimism and fluid lines. The new fifth generation was a complete rejection of that philosophy. It was a return to the sharp, upright, and boxy aesthetic that had defined the legendary third-generation cars of the late 80s. But this was not just retro styling for the sake of nostalgia. It was a deliberate attempt to signal maturity. The designers at Honda wanted the car to possess a certain visual heft. They were not interested in making another boy racer that looked fast while standing still. They wanted a car that looked substantial. The lines were drawn with a ruler, not a brush. The front end was dominated by large vertical headlamps that gave the car a wide, serious stare. The rear deck was high and cut off abruptly, a classic notchback profile that prioritized a formal silhouette over aerodynamic slipperiness. This was a car designed for an adult who wore a suit to work, not a teenager looking for a street race. It had a presence that commanded respect rather than demanding attention. This sense of intentionality continued the moment you opened the door. The cabin was designed not just to be seen, but to actively listen to its driver, which we will explore later. In an era where many manufacturers were cutting costs by using hard, shiny plastics, the interior of the Prelude felt like a sanctuary of quality. The dashboard was a single sweeping arc that wrapped around the driver, creating a distinct cockpit feel. The materials had a soft, tactile grain that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Every switch and button had a specific damping to it. When you pressed the hazard light button or turned the ventilation dial, there was a satisfying resistance that communicated precision. It is that sense of permanence we miss in modern interiors, where everything is a touchscreen or a haptic feedback pad. The instrument cluster was a masterclass in functional design. Gone was the sweeping digital dashboard of the previous model. In its place were traditional analog dials with brave orange needles set deep into a hooded binnacle. They were legible, simple, and serious. The driving position was low, placing the driver's hips close to the center of gravity. Yet the visibility was excellent thanks to the thin pillars and large greenhouse. It was a layout that prioritized the act of driving above all else. There were no cup holders that blocked the shifter. There were no distractions. Honda's obsession with refinement even extended to the audio system in the top-tier Type SH model. They installed a system called the acoustic feedback system. This was not just a marketing term. The car actually had a small microphone embedded in the rear of the cabin that constantly listened to the sound environment. The system would analyze the ambient noise and the music playback, then automatically adjust the equalizer frequencies to match a factory preset reference curve. This was 1997. Most cars barely had CD players, and Honda was installing active audio monitoring systems just to ensure the driver heard the music exactly as the engineers intended. It was a level of over-engineering that bordered on the obsessive. Then there were the wheels. In the mid-90s, a 14-inch steel wheel with a plastic cover was still the standard for most passenger cars. Even sporty models often made do with 15-inch alloys. Honda equipped every single fifth-generation Prelude with 16-inch aluminum alloy wheels as standard equipment. This was a massive wheel for the time. It filled the arches perfectly and allowed for lower-profile performance tires. It was a visual signal that this car was moving up market. The 5-lug hub pattern, replacing the 4-lug pattern of the past, was a subtle hint to mechanics and enthusiasts that the hardware underneath had been beefed up to handle more stress. But this sense of solidity was not just an aesthetic trick. It was a reflection of a fundamental reimagining of the car's skeleton. When the engineers began development, they set targets for chassis stiffness that seemed excessive for a car in this segment. They were not just trying to improve upon the previous model, they were trying to eliminate the flex that had plagued Japanese coupes of the bubble era. The result was a chassis that was 55% stiffer in bending and 24% stiffer in torsion than the car it replaced. To achieve those numbers, the team had to add metal. They used thicker gauge steel in critical load-bearing areas like the side sills and the roof pillars. They reinforced the rear bulkhead behind the seats, effectively turning the trunk area into a rigid box that tied the rear suspension towers together. They added additional welds to the floor pan and strengthened the subframe mounting points. This obsession with rigidity came with a penalty. The fifth-generation Prelude was heavier than its predecessor, a fact that drew criticism from magazine racers who only cared about quarter-mile times. But on the road, the extra mass translated into a composure that was rare for a front-wheel drive car. The chassis did not shudder over expansion joints, it absorbed them. It provided a stable platform that allowed the suspension to do its work without fighting the flex of the body. The stiffness was just the foundation for a secret hidden behind the front wheels, an engineering Easter egg that solved a problem other manufacturers simply ignored. That suspension was, in typical Honda fashion of the time, a masterpiece of packaging. While competitors were moving to cheaper, space-saving McPherson struts, Honda stuck to its guns with a four-wheel double wishbone layout. This design takes up more room in the engine bay and costs significantly more to manufacture, but it offers a crucial advantage in handling geometry. As the wheel moves up and down over bumps or leans into a corner, the double wishbone design keeps the tire contact patch perpendicular to the road. It ensures that the maximum amount of rubber is always gripping the pavement. This is why a Prelude from this era feels so planted in a turn, compared to a modern economy car that leans and rolls on its struts. The real magic of the front suspension was a detail almost nobody noticed. High-horsepower front-wheel drive cars have always suffered from torque steer, the tendency for the steering wheel to tug violently to one side under hard acceleration. To combat this, Honda completely redesigned the front lower control arm. Instead of a standard single A arm, they used a complex split design with two separate links, each with its own ball joint connecting to the steering knuckle. This unusual arrangement created a virtual pivot point that sat much closer to the center line of the wheel. By moving this pivot point, the engineers were able to reduce the steering kingpin offset from 43 millimeters down to just 25 millimeters. This drastic reduction meant that the engine's torque had less leverage to twist the steering wheel out of the driver's hands. It was a mechanical solution to a physics problem, achieved through complex geometry rather than electronic intervention. It allowed the driver to mash the throttle in a corner without fighting the steering wheel, preserving the purity of the feedback. The obsession with refinement went even deeper, down to the parts that no owner would ever see. If you were to crawl under the car and examine the drive shafts, you would find a peculiar rubber ring fitted to the dynamic damper on the half shaft. It looks like a simple donut of foam rubber, but its placement was calculated to cancel out specific harmonic vibrations from the drivetrain before they could reach the cabin. They identified a resonance frequency that caused a subtle hum at highway speeds and engineered a physical damper to absorb it. Most manufacturers would have simply added more carpet or turned up the radio volume. Honda redesigned the drive shaft assembly. This component is the perfect metaphor for the entire car. It was an invisible, over-engineered solution to a problem that most drivers would never have noticed in the first place. But the cumulative effect of these hundreds of small decisions was a car that felt cohesive. It wasn't just a visual trick. The chassis had become a rigid, vibration-free stage for the suspension. The suspension did not crash, it thudded. The steering did not vibrate, it hummed with information. This rigid, sophisticated chassis was the perfect stage. It was a platform built to support high performance without sacrificing comfort. It was stiff enough to handle aggressive driving, yet compliant enough to be a daily driver. But a chassis, no matter how brilliant, is just a skeleton. To bring it to life, it needed a heart that was equally ambitious. It needed an engine that could exploit the mechanical grip the engineers had worked so hard to create. To understand why the fifth-generation Prelude feels so alive compared to modern machinery, you have to look past the stiff chassis and the sophisticated suspension. You have to look at the heart of the car. In 1997, the automotive world was just beginning to flirt with the idea of forced induction and complex engine covers that hid the mechanical bits from view. Honda, however, was still committed to the purity of natural aspiration. They believed that a sports car engine should breathe on its own, responding instantly to the throttle without the lag of a turbocharger or the whine of a supercharger. The result of this philosophy was the H22A4, a 2.2-liter dual overhead cam VTEC engine that served as the centerpiece of the Prelude experience. This engine was a masterpiece of conflicting personalities. At low engine speeds, around town or in traffic, it was docile, but it held a violent secret that only revealed itself at a specific point in the rev range, a secret that required a specific, almost religious ritual from the owner to maintain. It idled with a quiet, steady hum. It offered enough torque to move the car along without drama, behaving with the politeness of a standard Accord powertrain. But the moment you buried the throttle and the tachometer needle swept past 5,200 revolutions per minute, the engine computer hydraulically engaged a second, more aggressive camshaft profile. The sound changed from a polite mechanical whir to a hard metallic growl. The intake noise deepened, resonating through the firewall and into the cabin. It was not a synthesized noise pumped in through speakers. It was the actual sound of the engine gulping vast quantities of air. For the driver, this created an addictive feedback loop. To get the most out of the car, you had to work for it. You had to keep the engine boiling near its red line at 7,400 revolutions per minute. Unlike modern turbocharged engines that give you most of their power at 2,000 revolutions per minute and then run out of breath. The H22A4 rewarded commitment. The harder you revved it, the more eager it felt. It was an engine that asked you to be involved in the process of speed, rather than just delivering it to you on a platter. The construction of the engine reflected Honda's refusal to compromise on durability for the sake of performance. The block was cast from aluminum to save weight over the front axle, a critical decision for a front-wheel drive car that needed to turn sharply. To ensure the cylinders could withstand the heat and friction of high revolutions per minute operation, the engineers installed iron liners inside the aluminum block. This combination of lightweight material and heavy-duty reinforcement allowed the engine to shed heat quickly while maintaining structural integrity under stress. It was a design born from their Formula One experience, bringing racetrack metallurgy to a street car that you could drive to the grocery store. Internally, the complexity continued. The H22A used a timing chain system rather than a belt to drive its camshafts, a choice that prioritized long-term durability and precise timing accuracy at high engine speeds. While this added to the mechanical intricacy of the build, it meant that the engine was robust enough to handle years of abuse. The valvetrain, the oil pump, and the cooling passages were all over-engineered. Evidence of this build quality is seen in how many of these engines are still running today. It is not uncommon to find Preludes with well over 200,000 miles on the original powertrain, still hitting the VTEC crossover point with the same ferocity they did when they left the showroom floor. This durability is one of the Prelude's enduring traits. However, this high-strung nature did come with a specific characteristic that owners came to know well. The H22A developed a reputation for consuming oil. This was not necessarily a sign of failure or a breakdown in the seals. It was often simply a byproduct of the engine's design tolerances and the high RPM operation it encouraged. When an engine spins at 7,000 revolutions per minute, the piston rings are moving at incredible speeds, and a certain amount of oil blow-by is inevitable. For the enthusiast, checking the dipstick every few fuel fill-ups became a ritual, a small price to pay for the mechanical symphony the engine provided. It was a quirk of the machine, like the heavy clutch pedal or the mechanical notch of the shifter. It was a reminder that you were operating a piece of high-performance equipment, not a maintenance-free appliance. Yet, despite the oil consumption and the complexity, the engine avoided catastrophic flaws. The cooling systems were robust, the electronics were shielded, and the fundamental architecture was sound. It was the last great analog heart of the Honda lineup before emissions regulations and the quest for fuel efficiency forced the industry towards smaller displacement, turbocharged engines. The H22A represented the pinnacle of what a four-cylinder engine could be when the only goal was driver engagement. But an engine, no matter how brilliant, is useless if it cannot put that power to the pavement. And for a front-wheel drive car with nearly 200 horsepower, that was the ultimate challenge. The engine was a masterpiece of traditional mechanical engineering, but the system designed to harness its power was something entirely different. It was a glimpse into a digital future. The biggest criticism leveled against high-performance front-wheel drive cars has always been understeer. When you push a front-heavy car into a corner too fast, the front tires become overwhelmed. They lose their grip on the pavement, and the car stubbornly plows straight ahead, refusing to turn no matter how much you crank the steering wheel. It is a terrifying sensation that usually forces the driver to lift off the throttle and slow down. Honda decided the solution was not to slow the car down, but to actively force it to turn. They called it the Active Torque Transfer System, ATTS for short. It was the defining technology of the top-tier Type SH model. In simple terms, it was a computer-controlled differential that could manipulate the distribution of power between the front wheels. In a normal car, an open differential sends power to the wheel with the least resistance, which is usually the inside wheel that is lifting off the ground in a hard turn. This wastes energy and destroys momentum. A limited slip differential locks the wheels together, which helps traction, but can make the steering feel heavy and resistant. Honda took a third path. The ATTS unit used a complex set of planetary gears and hydraulic clutches to actively overdrive the outside wheel during a corner. By spinning the outside wheel up to 15% faster than the inside wheel, the system generated a yaw moment that physically pushed the nose of the car into the turn. It is the same principle as paddling a canoe on one side to make it turn the other way. The sensation behind the wheel was unlike anything else on the road at the time. When a driver entered a sharp corner and felt the front tires begin to scrub and lose grip, the natural instinct was to back off. But in the Type SH, the correct response was to stay on the throttle. As you applied power, you could feel the system wake up. The car would suddenly tighten its line, rotating around the corner as if a giant hand had reached down and shoved the rear bumper. It allowed the Prelude to carry cornering speeds that embarrassed rear-wheel drive sports cars costing twice as much. What made this system truly special is how it differs from the technology used in modern cars. Today, almost every sporty crossover and hatchback claims to have torque vectoring. But in 99% of those cases, the car is simply using the anti-lock braking system to clamp down on the inside wheel. It creates rotation by slowing the car down and fighting the engine. The Honda system did the opposite. It created rotation by adding speed. It was a proactive mechanical solution rather than a reactive electronic band-aid. This obsession with high-tech control extended to the transmission options as well. While the manual gearbox was the enthusiast choice, the optional automatic was a marvel of 1990s computing power. Honda called it the sequential sport shift. It was one of the first transmissions in the affordable market to offer a manual mode that allowed the driver to select gears individually. The brain controlling this transmission was a 16-bit microprocessor, which was considered cutting edge for an automotive application at the time. It did not just shift gears based on speed, it used complex logic to understand the road. It had 8 different shift maps stored in its memory. If the computer detected that the car was climbing a hill, it would hold a lower gear to maintain momentum. If it sensed a descent, it would downshift to provide engine braking. The engineers even spent time debating the ergonomics of the manual shift gate. In a modern race car, you pull the lever back to upshift and push it forward to downshift, mimicking the G-forces of acceleration and braking. Honda, however, reversed this logic for the Prelude. You pushed the lever forward to shift up and pulled it back to shift down. They determined that for a street driver, pushing forward felt more like advancing, while pulling back felt like retreating. It was a counterintuitive choice to racing purists, but it showed how deeply the team thought about the psychology of the driver. These systems were expensive to develop and expensive to manufacture. The ATTS unit alone added nearly 45 pounds to the nose of the car, a complexity that required its own fluid and maintenance schedule. A rational company would have looked at the declining sales of sport coupes and decided that a simple limited slip differential was good enough. But Honda was not trying to be rational. They were trying to defy physics. They wanted to prove that a front-wheel drive platform could offer the same purity and precision as a rear-wheel drive chassis. The engineering was brilliant. The reviews were glowing. The car could slalom faster than a Porsche Boxster and out-handle a Ferrari 355 in certain conditions. It was a technical triumph that should have secured the Prelude's future for another decade. But while the engineers were busy perfecting the yaw rate sensors and hydraulic clutch packs, a much simpler, taller machine was already sitting on the showroom floor, waiting to end the Prelude's story forever. The market did not want a smarter coupe. It wanted something else entirely. While the engineering team at Honda was celebrating the technical triumph of the active torque transfer system, the sales teams on the showroom floors were facing a very different reality. The automotive landscape of 1997 was undergoing a seismic shift that no amount of suspension geometry could prevent. The greatest threat to the Prelude did not come from Toyota or Nissan. It came from the other side of the Honda dealership lot. The CR-V arrived in the United States the same year as the fifth-generation Prelude. It was slower, handled worse, and had none of the sophisticated double wishbone magic or high-revving spirit of the coupe. But it offered something that the market was suddenly desperate for: utility. For the same price as a base Prelude, a buyer could get a vehicle that carried 4 adults comfortably. The lifestyle vehicle had arrived, and it made the dedicated 2-door sports coupe look selfish and impractical by comparison. But the Prelude was not just fighting a war against the SUV. It was also fighting a civil war within Honda's own lineup. For the hardcore enthusiast, the driver who wanted pure speed and connection, the Acura dealership offered the Integra Type R. It was lighter, raw, and possessed a badge that screamed performance. It did not have the heavy sound deadening or the complex ATTS system, but it was faster around a track and cost slightly less. The Type R stole the glory, positioning itself as the true driver's car, leaving the Prelude in an awkward middle ground. It was too heavy to be a track toy, but too stiff to be a true luxury cruiser. Then there was the issue of price. In 1997, a fully loaded Prelude Type H commanded a sticker price of over $20,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is nearly $50,000 today. That price point placed the Prelude in a dangerous valley. It was significantly more expensive than the sport compacts like the Mitsubishi Eclipse or the Ford Probe, yet it lacked the prestige of the German entry luxury cars it was trying to emulate. For $26,000, you could buy a larger, more comfortable Accord coupe with a smooth V6 engine and leather seats. The Prelude asked buyers to pay a premium for invisible engineering, for chassis stiffness and differential trickery, rather than visible status symbols. It was a hard sell to anyone who wasn't a die-hard engineer at heart. By the turn of the millennium, the writing was on the wall. Sales had trickled to a halt. In a telling move during the final year of production in 2001, Honda Canada released a special SE trim. It looked like the top-tier Type SH, complete with the spoiler and the alloy wheels, and it even came with heated leather seats. But underneath, it was just a base model. The expensive, heavy, complex active torque transfer system was gone. It was a moment of rationalization that signaled the dream was over. The market wanted the look of a sports car, but it was no longer willing to pay for the technology that made it special. When production finally ended in October of 2001, there was no replacement. The Integra evolved into the RSX, moving down market to capture the youth tuner crowd. The Accord coupe grew larger and softer to satisfy the American commuter. The Prelude, with its high-tech differential and uncompromising chassis, simply ceased to exist. It was not a failure of engineering, it was a failure of timing. The world had moved on to high-riding utility vehicles, leaving the low-slung, technology-laden personal coupe as a relic of a more optimistic, driving-focused past. Despite the sales collapse that marked its end, the fifth-generation Prelude has managed to pull off a quiet miracle in the decades since. It survived. If you look at its contemporaries, like the Nissan 240SX, they have largely vanished from the roads. The rear-wheel drive Nissans were consumed entirely by the drift scene, smashed into concrete walls, or modified beyond all recognition. The Toyota Celicas of the era often dissolved into rust or faded into mechanical obscurity. But the Prelude endures in surprising numbers. Part of this survival is due to the specific demographic it originally attracted. Because it was expensive and marketed as a mature, near-luxury tourer, it was often purchased by older professionals rather than young street racers. These cars spent their early lives in heated garages, not doing burnouts in fast food parking lots. When they eventually passed to second owners, the massive Honda ecosystem kept them alive. Beneath the complex ATTS hardware and the stiff chassis, the car shares its DNA with millions of Accords and Civics. You can still walk into an auto parts store today and buy an alternator, a wheel bearing, or a control arm bushing off the shelf. This accessibility mattered. This accessibility shielded the Prelude from the exotic tax that killed other complex coupes. Mechanics were not afraid of it. The sophisticated underpinnings were intricate, but they were familiar. The engine was high-tech, but it was logical. Today it represents the most accessible entry point into the golden era of Japanese manufacturing. It offers that specific tactile mechanical connection, the heavy hydraulic steering, the instant response of the cable throttle, and the distinct crossover of the VTEC cam, without the astronomical price tag of a Supra or an NSX. It remains a secret handshake among enthusiasts who value precision over tire smoke. It stands as a monument to a time when engineering curiosity drove product planning. We did not just lose a model name, we lost the concept of an attainable technology showcase. It was a machine built for a sophisticated future that never arrived.